Okay.
Hey, John.
Hey, how are ya?
I guess it's time for another State of the Universe report.
Yeah. Boy, lots happened in the last week, too. Hey, George, I have to ask you something, though,
Sure.
first. My kids, ever since I first forced them to watch Blogging Heads...
I bet you didn't have to force them.
Well, you know, a little bit. Now they actually think it's kind of interesting. I don't know if they've ever watched the whole thing. But every time that they look at it, they have the same reaction. They immediately say, "There's Jack Bauer! There's Jack Bauer!"
Jack Bauer?
That's you.
Who's Jack Bauer?
Oh, God. George, you know a lot about science, but not about junk culture. You've heard of the show 24.
Yeah, I watched it. Actually, I watched it once, I think when it first came out, and I mentioned it in a piece that I'd written on 9/11, and you know how quickly it was okay to have a show like this with terrorist scenes and
torture.
And I
Lots of torture.
Speculated on that, but I haven't watched it since. I wasn't too impressed.
Well, listen, I hope this isn't dismaying to you, but my kids think you are a dead ringer for Kiefer Sutherland, who, of course, plays the main character, Jack Bauer, who is this really ruthless American agent who's...
I like this.
Yeah. You know,
this guy, he must be like in his 30s, right?
Yeah, you know, he's young and dynamic, George.
No, okay. You know,
and, the thing is, I have a hard time
watching.
seeing it, not because I don't think you're young and dynamic, but because I think of you as being a pretty gentle soul and not somebody who would be torturing bad guys all the time, which is what Jack Bauer does.
Well, I've never had the opportunity. So, it's like, it may be wired in there.
You have hidden dark sides. Okay.
Yeah.
I'll keep that in mind.
Yeah, well, that's cool. What night is it on, do you know?
It's on Monday nights.
Oh, okay. So that's
since
when
I brought it up,
Heroes is on.
I just have to mention there was actually an amazing article in the New Yorker, I think by Jane Meyer about it, who's sort of covering the torture beat for the New Yorker, and she pointed out that there are lots of interrogators in Iraq and elsewhere, American interrogators, who love the show.
Oh.
And the show always depicts torture as being very effective. And
very cool
so these
and
interrogators think that, according to this article in the New Yorker, think that, if it works on TV, it must work in real life. So Meyer thinks that this show has actually led to an increased acceptance of torture in the American military.
Wow, and in the American public, too.
Yes.
Funds. I'll have to read that. Wow.
Because there's always this debate about media violence and real-world violence.
Yeah.
This article, I thought, made the case more effectively than anything I've read before, that this particular show actually leads to increased violence, in this case torture, in the real world.
Wow, and it's such a different context, since usually, what's talked about are the, the shoot-'em-up gang-type movies that, glorify these L.A. thugs and, and make it look really cool to, go around with a machine gun and do drive-by shootings. But, let's not get into guns again.
No more. Okay, we'll stay away from violence.
Yeah, I think it'd be easy to overestimate the extent to which people care about our opinions on that.
That's true. Okay.
At least
anyway.
Back to science.
Back to science.
Yeah, so that was quite a coincidence. I mean, people probably would think it was planned that we both ended up having these pieces on neurotheology, quote unquote, in Slate this week, and neither of us knew that was happening until after we did our last conversation. Last week when we were emailing about something else, I think, and it just kind of came up in passing. Also, you're the other person that he's referring to. So, I thought that was a good package. It was kind of funny too. Another coincidence is, I started my piece with this scene back when we were in Cambridge, England, for that Templeton Fellowship, and we were listening to the talk about Buddhist meditation, and he was having us meditate on the essence of a raisin, and then I kind of went on to use that as a device to get into this piece on how neuroscientists, just kind of like following in the tracks of the physicists, are trying to find God in science, and how it's completely hopeless because you can always interpret the experiments two ways.
Yeah. I mean, I find this field fascinating, but in a way, it's completely inconsequential if what you hope is to come to some resolution on the question of whether God exists. So the problem is that all of our beliefs, all of our knowledge or pseudo-knowledge, of course, is based in particular brain states. I mean, how else...
Yeah, I mean, that's all these experiments show is, when the brain does different things, different parts light up, and,
And even the fact, you pointed out in your piece that there have been some famous mystics who, I think this was in your piece, some famous mystics who almost certainly were suffering from some kind of mental illness, epilepsy or schizophrenia.
Yeah, temporal lobe epilepsy.
That's right.
Yeah.
And even in that case, so you could say, our visions of God are somehow related to delusional states. The problem is, even people who are mentally ill can have genuine, profound insights into life and nature and so forth. Or can be immensely talented. So you've got just one example from art. Vincent van Gogh obviously was mentally ill, but he still produced these wonderful works of art.
Well, yes, and Dostoevsky was believed to have temporal lobe epilepsy and wrote a wonderful description of the experience in The Idiot. And so, these experiments really don't get you anywhere because you can interpret them in two ways. You can say, well, obviously God designed our brains to be spiritual resonators so he could talk to us, or you could say, these experiments show God's obviously all in the head and it's just neural firings, but everything's just neural firings.
Yeah, William James addressed this in Varieties of Religious Experience, and he said, he sort of addressed the question of the biology of religious experiences, which of course was much more primitive then, but he still reached the same conclusion that we're forced to reach now, which is that the only way you can really judge religious and mystical experiences... Oh, excuse me, let me...
Oh, sure. Yeah, go ahead and get
disconnect. I'm not going to get it. I'm just going to disconnect it.
Yeah. Well, I was kind of curious who it was.
There's probably, who knows who it was.
I forget sometimes we're not doing this live, so it couldn't have been somebody calling in to object. And, if we could do a phone-in show.
So anyway, what William James says is that the only way we can judge these experiences by their fruits, not their roots. In other words...
They're fruits, not... Oh, okay.
They're fruits, not their roots. So you have to sort of look at an experience of St. Teresa or St. John of the Cross or Muhammad or Jesus, and all these experiences that are described in our great religious documents, and then you have to sort of judge them on their own merits. What do they tell us about how to live their lives and how reality is constructed? And then we try to make sense of them in light of what else we know. That's still the same. That was the situation 100 years ago when James is writing, and it's still the situation now.
So he's kind of saying, being agnostic on whether these visions are actually communications from the gods, and just basically saying, whatever they are, you take them like a book or a speech or a piece of music, and then it's the effects they have on the world, and maybe they get people to treat each other better, or feel a sense of transcendence. And James was probably an agnostic, wasn't he?
He was a desperate seeker.
Yeah.
So he was somebody who suffered from these terrible panic attacks. They actually landed him in a mental hospital in Boston, McLean, I think it's called.
That's right.
Fairly extended periods. It was a sort of intense existential anxiety that he felt. So he pursued all these self-help therapies throughout his life. Some involved physical therapy, some involved various psychotherapies. He also experimented with what we might call psychedelic drugs. He sniffed ether, he took nitrous oxide, he even took peyote once.
Really? All in search of visions.
Yeah. Well, none of these things really did much for him. They didn't really dispel this pervasive sense of anxiety that he had.
Now, do you know if he wrote Varieties of Religious Experience before or after his Principles of Psychology?
That was after.
After, because I recently read parts of Principles of Psychology when I was writing a chapter for my experiments book on Pavlov, and God, it's just so modern, and you think most of it could be written now. Partly that's testimony of how much, how little more we understand about the brain now than we did when James was writing, but and just the writing itself is just exquisite.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, so most of us today, as much as many of us deny it, are still Freudians, and Freud is still the benchmark by which almost all modern theories of the mind and behavior are judged. And
this is so much more insightful.
Yeah, James, and when you read Freud, and it's so archaic and Baroque and Victorian, whereas you're right, James is so modern. I haven't read a lot of Principles of Psychology, just excerpts, but Varieties of Religious Experience is one of my favorite books. I've read it several times.
Yeah, I remember he brought that up a lot in Cambridge. And
yeah, it really holds up well over time. Well, so the piece that I wrote for Slate, it got into something that I think we discussed in our first blogging head, so I won't go into it all that much. But it's the possibility of taking this research into the biology of religious experience and coming up with technologies that might induce these experiences more effectively.
Yes, you're actually creating the visions, and I wanted to ask you about your experience where you actually went to this guy. We did mention this before. We didn't really get into the details that you put on the God helmet where your electromagnetic pulses are used to, I guess, to sort of induce supposedly a little mini temporal lobe epileptic fit. Is that?
That's right. Yeah. And there actually is a commercial device based on this technology called
the Shakti helmet. Yeah, I saw the Shakti helmet. I mean, that sounded so...
I wish I'd thought of that, Shakti helmet. Well, I still think, since I grew up in the 60s, sort of late 60s person, by far the most powerful mystical technology is still psychedelic drugs. Yeah. And there is this renaissance in research on psychedelics. I mean, it was completely wiped out basically in the late 60s when there was this backlash against Timothy Leary and some of these other proselytizers for psychedelics. There had been this huge wave in the 50s and 60s of research into psychedelics. Some of it was really promising. It collapsed, and now, very quietly...
Wasn't some of that funded by the CIA, and that was part of the reason for it not, being considered so...
It was funded, the CIA was interested in these drugs as brainwashing agents, and, so there was this whole dark side of the research, but a lot of psychiatrists were interested in the therapeutic potential of psychedelics for treating alcoholism, mental illness, and that's what's coming back now. So there are people at Harvard and UCLA and University of Arizona who are...
Timothy Leary was at Harvard.
That's right.
So it's coming back full... But do they have better drugs now?
No, they're testing the same drugs pretty much.
LSD and DMT
Not LSD. LSD is still pretty much demonized. So as far as I know, nobody's carrying out a legal trial of LSD now. But there are several trials underway involving psilocybin, which is the active ingredient of magic mushrooms.
Right.
So there's a guy, the guy at Harvard is treating terminal cancer patients with psilocybin to see if it relieves their anxiety.
Yeah.
There is one psychedelic, you just mentioned it,
Dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah, DMT, dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah, I remember that from college. I never tried any of these things. So, I sort of wish I had because, now I'd be afraid to. I sort of, that in college is when I should have done it, I suppose.
Well, okay, I'm not going to encourage you to do it, but...
I did try some alleged psilocybin once because a friend and I was in a rock band in those days, and we'd just gotten off one of our rare gigs. It was like the rarest of occasions that someone would pay us to make this noise. And then we got in his car and drove to visit a friend of ours who was living in San Francisco in the Mission District.
Uh-huh.
And I was reading Tom Wolfe's book on the electric Kool-Aid acid test,
yes.
and just getting totally into the mood. And by this time, Haight-Ashbury had pretty much, crashed and burned, but still we were kind of getting into the San Francisco mood. So then I was persuaded to try some alleged psilocybin.
Uh-huh. And how'd that go?
One thing I remember most vividly was, we had just finished the day before driving up Highway 1 along the coast, from Los Angeles north through Santa Barbara and then through Big Sur, and constantly seeing the ocean crashing, against the rocks. And this had apparently become burned into my mind because the morning after taking this drug, it wouldn't stop. That was one of the things I hated about it. It wouldn't go away. And we were walking around San Francisco, and out of the corner of my eyes, the street curves would turn into ocean breakers and then just kind of crash against the street for just a second, and then I'd glance and it would solidify. Yeah, but there was probably some other stuff in here because I felt really, really very, very jittery and just very uncomfortable, and I just wanted it to stop. And it
maybe it. I mean, they said the black chemists back then used to put all kinds of junk in the drugs, amphetamines and even.
Yeah, so he may not have been the best source, my friend. He was a piano player, actually. He was there to try to break into some rock bands that he was following, but then he ended up playing piano bar at a Holiday Inn in San Rafael.
What did you play, George?
I played electric bass.
Ah, cool.
Yeah, Fender Precision electric bass.
My son is a lead guitarist in a rock band.
Really? Oh, that's
to
great.
be honest, I can't see why anybody would want to play bass because it seems like the lead guitarists get all the they get all the glory and the girls.
Oh, well, actually, there was a certain element of groupies, such to the extent that we could be said to have had such a thing, who really liked the bass player because the bass player was kind of the quiet guy, sitting in back and thumping the reason I played bass is, we're really getting far afield of science here. But the reason I played bass was because it only had 4 strings, and I sort of failed trying to be. I knew I couldn't be a lead guitarist, so I tried being a rhythm guitarist. And then I realized that if you go down 2 more strings, it's a lot easier. And bass, too, is, you can, I wasn't really a very, very good musician, and you can, there's some great musicians who are bass players, but you can also get away with a lot because the notes are so low. And plus, this is kind of about science. I really was interested in harmonic structure, and in knowing the first, third, and fifth of the different keys. So I really liked to be able to analyze a chord and know which notes I could play and kind of experiment with the sounds. And mostly, I really liked to tinker with the vacuum tube guitar amplifiers. So, yeah.
Geez,
but,
I keep learning these new things about you, George.
I actually have a picture of my rock band on my website somewhere. I'll
put a link to it on when this discussion
good
goes
idea.
up.
Oh, good, I will. Yeah.
Hey,
but to get back to the Shakti helmet and
sure.
You felt nothing when you were supposed to feel like everything was one. And
yeah, that didn't really work for me. I'll tell you what I think is the most interesting line of research right now, going back to this drug, dimethyltryptamine. What's interesting about all these psychedelics as a class, LSD, psilocybin, and mescaline, which is the active ingredient of peyote, those are the classic psychedelics. they all are very similar to the brain's neurotransmitters, to serotonin and dopamine and some of the other major neurotransmitters.
Yeah.
Dimethyltryptamine, which is a more exotic psychedelic because you have to inject it or smoke it. It's not orally active normally.
Oh.
So it wasn't used nearly as much as any of the others back in our youth. But what's really interesting about it is that in the 60s, before psychedelic research was shut down, there were some scientists who discovered that DMT occurs naturally in the human brain.
Oh, yeah.
And there's this guy named, I think it's Axelrod, who won a Nobel Prize.
Oh, Julius.
Yes, who was involved in this discovery. And there was a lot of interest in whether some malfunction of DMT regulation in the brain might be responsible for psychosis, for schizophrenia, manic depression, some of the other mental illnesses. And then that all shut down. Now, there's this guy named Rick Strassman at the University of Arizona who has done research, somehow got a permit to carry out legal research on DMT back in the 90s, and wrote a book saying that he thinks naturally occurring DMT might be responsible for all kinds of mystical and religious experiences as well as psychosis. And he's talked about even, going back to mystical technologies, that you could have some kind of genetic engineering that changes the regulation of your DMT so that you become a full-time permanent mystic who always has a psychedelic vision of the world.
So does he think that this will be offered as like a medical procedure that?
He said, actually, he thought it might be possible.
Surgery for the mind.
You could have some kind of I don't know what if you would call a person like this a terrorist, but some kind of perverse chemist who comes up with a genetically modified virus, a cold virus, for example, that is infectious and that changes the DMT regulation in our brains and can spread around the world and turn us into a global society of DMT mystics.
Wow, an epidemic of mysticism.
Yeah.
Wow.
Far out.
I think that might already be happening. Maybe there's already, when you get these, like astrology and things like this, it seems like the fads go in waves. These old, this discredited knowledge from the Middle Ages, will suddenly burst on the scene again. And maybe it's always there as an undercurrent, but I'm just thinking, maybe there are these epidemics of mysticism going on throughout history. And
yeah, well, this also could explain some things going on in Washington.
Well, I wonder too if people, if this were available as a medical therapy, maybe people would want to be turned into mystics.
Well, something, George, a story that I've tried to publicize, but it hasn't gotten picked up by the mainstream press, that I think is really an interesting cultural trend. The Supreme Court, I think it was a year and a half ago, allowed a religious sect in New Mexico. I'm sure you've heard of this.
Oh yeah, right. It's just up in Taos, right?
That's right.
Or is it in Albuquerque?
Yeah. Well, I thought they were sort of Santa Fe, Taos, and your
that's all right in the neighborhood here. Yeah, that was covered a lot in the local papers, of course. But.
Well, so these are people who take this stuff called ayahuasca, this Amazonian brew that contains DMT and also contains some enzymes that make it orally active. And they drink this stuff as a sacrament in their religious ceremonies.
Yeah,
DMT
right.
Is,
quote unquote.
Yeah, apparently they're very serious about it. And so they got busted for importing this stuff from Brazil, and then they sued the government for the right to take it. Went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said they didn't have any problem with it. So as of now, my understanding is that this group, which is based on a legal religion in Brazil, is allowed to take ayahuasca, which contains DMT,
Yeah.
for religious purposes, in the same way that Indians are allowed to take peyote.
Yeah. I don't know. Do you really... I don't know. It sounds... I'm very skeptical that they really have this religion. I mean, if a religion just means that, well, you all sit around and there's this drug that you really like to take and you have visions, I mean, anyone could say, you know, they have this religion. You know, if you get 2 or 3 people, it's a religion, right? You can start a church and then get a license to take DMT or LSD or, you know, whatever you like. And
or, you know, the Rastafarians like to smoke dope as a sacrament.
Right. So why can't they do that?
Well, that's why I'm surprised that the Supreme Court made this ruling.
It's astonishing.
This is why the government opposed it, because they thought this would just be the beginning that everybody's going to be suing for the right to take drugs for religious purposes.
It's surprising that hasn't happened. Because this was wasn't it a couple years ago?
Yeah, it hasn't happened because I think it just hasn't been publicized at all. But it might happen as a result of some of this research that's going on. There was this study done just last fall, or announced last fall, by a group at Johns Hopkins University. They gave psilocybin, again, to a group of people. I think it was maybe 30, 40 people, a control group, and then a group of other people who took the drug. And most of the people who took psilocybin said that they had this profound, transcendent spiritual experience. So, you know, maybe the zeitgeist is changing on these things. Who knows?
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah. I mean, it kind of did in the 60s for a while, and then, well, I don't know, it was always, they tried to regulate it in the 60s, but it just, you know, it didn't really work, I guess. But you're thinking there might become a societal acceptance of this, like beyond people who are just, you know, rebellious and experimental.
Well, that seems to be, I don't know, it seems that the signs are there with the research being pretty respectable and this group being allowed to take it as a religious sacrament. So anyway, it's something I'm keeping my eye on.
Yeah.
Hey, listen, there are a couple other stories in that Slate issue.
Yeah.
I wonder if you noticed.
There's that one by Alison Gopnik.
Yeah, what'd you think of that?
That was great. It was debunking the mirror-neuron thing. I remember when I first read about these mirror neurons. So, I guess basically, this is the idea, right? So, they found that in macaque monkeys, certain parts of the brain light up when they, maybe they scratch their head. And then if they see another macaque monkey scratching its head, the same neurons light up.
Yeah.
And this is called mirror neurons. And then it was just extrapolated to just this incredible extent where all these neuroscientists were saying, well, this is probably the source of human empathy, and it's why we like to watch sports on television, and it just went on and on, and people talked about mirror neurons as though, like, you know, I mean, to me, neurons are kind of like transistors in a computer or a radio, and depending on where they are in this complex circuit, they might do all kinds of things, and to say that there's actually neurons that are individually, you know, somehow evolved to mirror the world and allow you to have social empathy, and I don't know, it seemed to me really overblown.
Yeah, you know, I first heard a talk when I was out in California. I think it was 97. I was with a group of neuroscientists, including Francis Crick, Christoph Koch, and some others, and the Italian guy who originally discovered these things gave a talk. I hadn't heard about them before, and I didn't really understand the significance myself, but I could tell that Crick and some of these other people were really excited. Huh. But my reaction is the same as yours. I mean, now you've got these things that they seem to have this peculiar property that you know, they fire not only if you're grabbing something, but when you see something else, some other creature grabbing something. But built on that sort of peculiar and fairly narrow finding, you've got theories that now are attributing language and morality and altruism and empathy and all our social interactions the theories are based on this little tiny, frail finding, and which to me sort of reinforces my sense that neuroscientists are so desperate for that one keystone finding that makes everything else fall into place.
Once again, missing what physics has, which is a unifying theory of sorts. And and I thought Alison Gopnik really just kind of exposed that very.
She nailed it. I was really impressed by that piece. But there is you said what you just said. One of your doubts about mirror neurons was that you think of neurons as fairly simple devices, just transistors. I did a piece for Discover about, I guess it was about 2 years ago now, on this finding. Again, this is Christoph Koch, this guy I just mentioned, and some other people who discovered that single neurons apparently are responsive to specific individuals. You've probably heard about this. The first finding was the Bill Clinton neuron.
Yeah, but that's kind of like the old myth of the grandmother gene. I mean, the grandmother neuron, right? Where there's a neuron in your... But, I mean, this is how... this is what I don't understand. I mean, it seems to me if you take the very, loose metaphor that the brain consists of circuitry made of neurons, and you can have some complex circuit that maybe... Well, let's say it models your grandmother, like over all these years of interaction with your grandmother, you've built up this kind of simulation of her in your brain, which is represented by networks of neurons that are connected to somehow, we have no idea how, but to somehow represent your grandmother. So this might be, who knows, maybe 1 million of these neurons. And so you see your grandmother, this circuitry is going to be activated, and then you just happen to be measuring one of these neurons, and it lights up, and you say, oh, I've found the grandmother neuron. And this is how mirror neurons seem to me. I mean, no doubt macaque monkeys, like people, have these circuits that are built up to mirror or model the world, and they're going to have a circuit that's going to be scratching head, and it's going to fire, whether the head's being scratched by the owner of the brain or by another monkey, and then you measure one of these neurons and say, oh, this is a mirror neuron. But is there more to it than that?
Well, I guess what interests me about these findings, and I know more about these individual recognition cells because I did this article and hung out with a team of researchers, and this involves sticking electrodes in the brains of epileptic patients, and which is this is very unusual research because you can't ordinarily just stick electrodes in people's brains to see how neurons work. But it's really extraordinary that there are these neurons that respond, for example, just to images of Bill Clinton and all different kinds of images, to paintings or drawings or photographs. Clinton with his wife or Clinton with other leaders, but then you just have some other famous figure and it doesn't light up. So what it indicates to me, and this is what Koch thought might be the significance, is that instead of individual neurons being transistors or simple switches, each individual neuron might be like a mini computer in its own right. So it just exponentially expands the computational power of the brain, if you think of it like that. Individual neurons might be much more clever, if you want to put it that way, than neuroscientists had thought.
So more specialized, so they're not like the transistor or the vacuum tube of the brain. They're not these units that just play a role in the circuit where the meaning has always been... I mean, boy, if that's true, we really... It's just like starting over from zero, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, that's why I like it.
Yeah, the main progress has really been, to me, this computer metaphor and the idea of thinking, of all the actions going on the level of the circuitry and not on the individual neuron. And I still don't see though how they would know, like if you have a Bill. I mean, you can't really. You monitor a neuron and say this is a Bill Clinton neuron, and then the one right next to it doesn't light up.
That's apparently how it works.
I don't think they can. Can they really zoom in that? That precisely? I don't know.
All I can say is that, oh yeah, they definitely can. Attach these electrodes to individual neurons.
Yeah, I know that, but then to test the one right next to it and see that one's not firing.
Well, they've got an array of neurons that are all attached to, or of electrodes that are all attached to different neurons. So whether or not they're getting two neurons that are directly adjacent, I don't think they're doing that, because then they might have interference.
So I just still don't see. Yeah.
I would think that I'm waiting for
I'll have to
somebody
go back and
out.
reread your article, because I know I read it when it came out, and
the thing is, the people who are doing this work are really they're as good as it.
Well, Christoph Koch, yeah. I mean, if he thinks it's interesting,
and it's been printed in Nature. I keep waiting for somebody to do a big critique and pointing out technical problems, sort of along the lines that you just mentioned now. But as far as I know, these have really held up, and
wow.
They're generating a lot of interest and excitement, even though it as you said, it sort of means that the model of the brain, if the brain is a digital computer, it's so much more complicated than people had thought.
Oh, sure. I mean, it was already. I mean, even if neurons are essentially like transistors, obviously there's going to be different input-output curves for some different kinds of neurons. But even if that's the metaphor, and it's a computer at that level, it's incredibly complex. But then to think that instead it's like an internet of supercomputers, of 100 billion supercomputers.
Well, if you think about it, one neuron might have as many as, I think it's 10,000 synaptic connections to other neurons. So I think that complexity alone dwarfs the complexity of any known artificial computer.
Oh, well, sure, yeah. It probably dwarfs the complexity of the internet. And yeah, it makes, I don't know. Maybe,
neuroscience is hard.
Yeah, and the computer metaphor, sometimes it's a little too strained. But it's hard to imagine what else it could be.
It's all we've got now. Hey, there's just one other piece that I also liked in the Slate issue. And what I liked about the overall feeling of the issue was that I thought it had a nice balance between sort of gee whizzism, excitement about some of these findings, and skepticism and doubt, and pointing out the limitations. So Megan O'Rourke had a piece on neuroplasticity mania.
Yeah.
In which she talked about, so neuroplasticity is this buzzword that refers to the fact that the brain is constantly rewiring itself and adapting to new experiences and challenges and so forth. And there is this whole industry now that's arisen trying to take advantage of this capacity of the brain and creating these exercises and gadgets to exercise our brain and make us improve our memories and our cognitive functions and so forth. And of course, this is very attractive to aging baby boomers like you and me as we're approaching senility. So, and O'Rourke points out that, for example, if you play Sudoku, is that how you pronounce it?
Oh, yeah, I know what you mean. It's this Japanese number crossword puzzle type thing.
Yeah, and I guess it's a phenomenon. I've never played it myself, but I guess
I know, I'm really bad at that stuff.
It really has taken off, and she says, so people play this and they think this means it'll improve their intelligence and memory and so forth in general, and it actually just makes you much better at Sudoku.
Playing Sudoku or whatever it is.
Right.
Yeah.
So you don't get this sort of carry over into all these other cognitive functions that people
they're trying. It's interesting that they've come up with products now, because I first really started following neuroplasticity back in the early 90s, and I wrote a book called In the Palaces of Memory.
Oh, I love that book.
Oh, thanks.
When I first started covering the neuroscience beat for Scientific American, I read your book to try to bring me up to speed.
I think that was before I met you.
Yeah.
Yeah, possibly. Yeah. Well, thanks. And what keeps and the idea there was how the brain changes so that we can record memories, and how it is that we can carry around these pictures of the world in our heads, and and form these new synaptic links and things, and it's just fascinating to go to some of the labs and see the research, and then about 10 years later, at least, I was asked by Time magazine to do a piece for a special issue they were doing on memory, kind of updating what scientists have learned about the neuroscience of memory. And I went back and looked, and it seemed like the field had advanced remarkably little. It was really the same controversies and the same factions and
long-term potentiation and Eric Kandel and all this.
Yeah, right, and the CA1 region of the hippocampus, and and of course there have been some little incremental advances, but I think nothing like the enthusiasm, nothing like what was expected back in the enthusiasm of the early 90s. And I remember talking to this one neuroscience researcher, Gary Lynch, at the University of California at Irvine, and they actually had some deals going with startup companies for drugs that would be used to prevent Alzheimer's or fight Alzheimer's, and they were all based on some kind of mechanism they'd found that supposedly explained how two neurons can suddenly form a new link, and then part of a circuit, or two neurons start talking to each other and then integrate themselves into this new computer module, and nothing really came of that, and then now we seem to have another round of people saying that there are these applications, but not so much drugs, but these little exercises. And,
well, I remember. So I wrote my second book, Undiscovered Mind, in the late 90s, and the 90s, as you know, was declared the decade of the brain. Neuroscientists all lobbied Congress to do this, and they got the 90s declared the decade of the brain. And I remember talking to Torsten Wiesel, this great neuroscientist at Rockefeller University, who won a Nobel Prize for some seminal findings in the 50s about how the brain perceives objects. And Wiesel thought the idea of a decade of the brain was stupid, because he said the idea that we're going to sort of crack the brain in the next decade is absurd. We need at least a decade, if not a millennium, to figure out how the brain works, according to Wiesel. Yeah,
and he was the guy who did those really interesting experiments with David Hubel.
Yes.
Is that right? Where they showed that that kittens had certain cells that responded to vertical lines and certain cells that responded to horizontal lines, and
right.
But as Alison Gopnik pointed out in her article, that's apparently been shown not to be quite as clear-cut as...
Yeah, that was interesting. I hadn't read that either. No, Gopnik packed a lot of very constructive criticism into that little piece. Yeah,
it was good. Well done,
So, should we skip from
that's
neuroscience?
Maybe enough on neuroscience and
Neurotheology. How about planetary science?
Well, that's a transition. I guess that was really what's being seen as the big story of the week: the discovery of the new planet orbiting the star 20 light years away. And to me that seems, the discovery of a planet, to me it was more like the inference of the planet.
This is a really interesting field. It's exciting. I think it's it's obviously related to the search for life elsewhere, and which I think is one of the that's one of the great outstanding questions of all time. Are we alone in the universe? And it's a difficult question to address, and this is one fairly concrete way that you can go about trying to answer it, just finding other planets that are analogous to the Earth, and therefore there might be some probability that life exists on these planets. But the curmudgeon in me comes out when these things are reported, because people just get, they think we're on the verge of shaking hands with E.T. when we find one of these things, as you know, that prospect isn't really any closer.
Well, what really strikes me is what counts is discovering a new planet. I mean, basically, what they see is the star wobbles in a certain way that can then be analyzed and interpreted as being caused by something orbiting around it that's giving it a gravitational tug, cyclical gravitational tug as it goes around year by year. And then the reason they can say that the planet is wobbling is because its light is kind of doing a little Doppler effect, as though you had a siren that was like, vibrating towards you and away from you, and you get this little warble. So they analyze the warble, infer there's a planet, they infer how far the planet is away, and from its light they figure out it's something called a red dwarf, and then they use these theories that they have of stellar physics to figure out how much energy the star is putting out, and therefore they can say that it's cooler than the sun, and they can use the analysis of the wobble to show that the planet's a certain mass. Again, if they assume that they know the mass of the red dwarf star, and if it's wobbling in a certain amount or in a certain way, they can say that the planet that they infer that's going around it has to be of a certain mass. And then they can use Kepler's laws to show how far the planet has to be from the star. And then they can say, well, it's going to have the right temperature so we can have life.
Well, I was willing to grant that this was a legitimate finding, but after hearing you analyze it, I realized I was maybe giving them too much credit.
I don't know. I mean, it's obviously accepted as a legitimate way to do this by people who know a whole lot more about this than I do, but it just doesn't always come. I just saw one article where it really came across, just these layers and layers of inference, and that was in The Economist. And
yeah. The story that I saw in the Times, I guess I'm interested in sort of the sociological aspects of this. Mm-hmm. So the article in the Times they had a pull-out quote from a researcher named Dimitar Sasolov from Harvard, who says, it's 20 light years away. We can go there.
Yes, I remember. Well,
we can go there. All right, so I want to point out to something. And by the way, this isn't just a journalist. It's not like David Brooks or some pundit. And by the way, Bob Wright, we should mention, has a really nice riff in the New York Times on the op-ed page on this finding that came out Saturday morning, today, when this is aired.
Yeah. Or will come out, since we're actually
that's right. It's Friday now, but this will come out tomorrow. So anyway, but as going back to this question of, we can go there, I just want to point out something. The fastest spacecraft that exists now goes roughly 50,000 miles an hour. That's roughly 20 miles a second. That's the New Horizons spacecraft, which I think was just launched or is just about to be launched. Mm-hmm. At that velocity, this thing would take 300,000 years to reach a star 20 light years away.
Yeah.
So the idea that, we're going to travel, this is one of the closest stars that there is. The absolute closest star is 4 light years away. That's Alpha Centauri. So, you can divide by 5, and it still takes 60,000 years to get to Alpha Centauri. Space travel to other stars is not going to happen. I'm sorry, I hate to be such a grouch about this. By the way, there was a...
well, even at the speed of light, 20... which, you were not going to have a spaceship going the speed of light, but even if you could, which is, as fast as you could go, it's still 20 years, and then when you got there and wanted to send back, a message saying, hey, we got there, that would take another 20 years to get back to Earth. So.
I hate to be, we talked about this this is an example of the Star Trek effect where people, and again, this is a scientist, this Dimitar fellow, who is saying this. Maybe he's just joking around, but I think it's the Star Trek effect.
He was probably just being kind of ironic.
I don't know. Did you see the Blogging Heads segment? It was with I forget who the other person was. One of the
Oh, David Korn and
Pinkerton.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And they were.
I just watched the clip.
Planet.
Yeah, that was good.
Yeah, and Pinkerton was, as I recall, saying that this is this is great. We can send people to these other planets.
Oh well, yeah. He was just kidding.
I just have to say, I had a brief run-in with Pinkerton about 15 years ago. I did a profile of Thomas Kuhn, the great philosopher, for Scientific American, and one of the theme of the piece was that Kuhn had this term called paradigm, which described this sort of mindset of scientists that channels their thinking about their scientific results and the sorts of experiments that they design. And I talked about how this term, paradigm, had been sort of corrupted and let loose in culture at large in ways that really horrified Kuhn. And one of the examples that I used was the term called the new paradigm, which is what some Bushies, this is the first Bush, George Bush Sr., were using to describe Bush's economic policies, the new paradigm. So in my piece, I called the new paradigm warmed over Reaganism. And James Pinkerton wrote a letter to me, and he was deeply offended and said that actually the new paradigm was not warmed over Reaganism. It was really fresh and creative and compassionate conservatism and so on and so forth and all this.
It's still a paradigm.
Yeah.
Yeah, which has been sort of degraded to mean just like mindset or gestalt or...
Right. Yeah. It's a good word if it's a good pretentious word. If you want to impress people, you use...
Yeah, I use it all the time.
So do I.
Kay Davidson's just finished a biography of Thomas Kuhn.
Is that right?
Yeah, I think it's going to be great. It's I had dinner with him in San Francisco when I went to the AAAS meeting there in February, and I think he's, it's been years in the making, and finally going to the publisher, and maybe when that comes out we can talk about that.
Oh, definitely. Thomas Kuhn is one of my favorite. The conversation that I had with him was one of the best encounters I've ever had with any scientific figure. And he really disliked the press. He was very distrustful of them because he always felt that his ideas were being distorted. And of course they were distorted by everybody, not just by the press, by philosophers.
By scientists.
And what I concluded after talking to Kuhn for, it was 4 or 5 hours, I interviewed him he was at MIT then, and I decided that Kuhn himself was deeply confused over his own philosophy. That there's this ambiguity in his writings that reflected an ambiguity in his own thinking, I don't think he really understood his own philosophy as much as he sometimes pretended.
Or maybe he was kind of spooked by some of the more radical implications. And I mean, maybe isn't the way it was often interpreted is if you say science is a paradigm, it's like this network of assumptions and beliefs and theories and experimental results, and you have all this data, and it's sort of magnetized by this field into a certain shape, and then that's the paradigm, and then all of your science is kind of done within this set of assumptions, and then there'll be some little anomalies along the edge that don't fit in, and suddenly you'll realize that the paradigm can't explain them, and it will collapse and then be reformed into some whole new other shape. And
the way he wrote about it, he really made it sound as though there was this sort of irrational, pathological, or at least political element in science, and in the way that scientists reach agreement on a particular theory, and then when other philosophers seized on this and used it to challenge the authority of science. This is sort of the basis of the postmodern position,
Right.
Kuhn threw up his hands and said, "That's not what I meant at all."
Yeah.
But actually, I think that is at least one legitimate reading of Kuhn. I mean, he had these weird little throwaway lines in Structure of Scientific Revolutions. At one point, he was talking about how scientists are absolutely committed to a particular paradigm, for all these sort of extra rational and extra scientific reasons, and he compared them to drug addicts.
Huh.
So
That's sort of inviting a pretty radical interpretation.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah.
So, and Paul Feyerabend, this other scientist I interviewed for Scientific American, and then he was a character in my book, The End of Science. He said that the way that Kuhn described scientists reaching agreement on a particular theory was very much like how enforcement occurs in the mob, in the mafia. And he did this just to tweak Kuhn, and of course Kuhn was outraged by that comparison too. But again, you can, it's a reasonable reading of Kuhn.
It doesn't seem surprising to me that, we're constructing these sciences from inside the universe. We can't step out and get at a completely objective view. We're part of the system we're trying to explain, so what we're going to come up with are these kinds of constellations of ideas and data that might be thought of as the paradigm, and this is naturally going to become like becomes like the epistemological air you breathe. Someone put it that way, I think. And so therefore you're going to see things through, or think of it as this lens. You're going to see things refracted through this paradigm, this network of assumptions, beliefs, and findings, and you're going to naturally figure out ways to fit the new data into the structure. And it might mean positing the existence of a new particle, or occasionally even a new law. And then if the thing gets so unwieldy that it's just can't really stand anymore, it may collapse and then come back and be structured in a different way. And that doesn't mean that you can't use it to predict and explain reality, but it's just kind of rejecting this idea that there's this Platonic non-paradigm out there that we're all kind of slowly moving toward.
Yeah, he definitely rejected that idea of sort of understanding reality as it is. He said everything has to be mediated by our concepts and by language. And I think what Kuhn what his philosophy was really about was the limits of language and the limits of comprehension through language, which is our only way of knowing the world. And what was fascinating and paradoxical and sort of tragic about Kuhn was that he had this book, The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, that made this case for the limits of language, of scientific language, for understanding reality, and how there will inevitably be these misunderstandings and miscommunications between scientists, and language is always this sort of imperfect way of knowing things. And then he sent that out into the world, and then people started interpreting it in different ways, which of course is a prediction of his own view of the world. And he was horrified and spent the rest of his life trying to explain what he really meant, when his book said it's impossible to say what you really mean.
God, that's a wonderfully deep irony. I mean, it's like postmodernists trying to explain what postmodernism is, or
right.
It's more like asking a postmodernist what postmodernism is, and it says, well, you can't really explain it, and you can't give, it just is. You can't boil it down and simplify it into, or abstract it into something that's easier to grasp, because
right.
That's
By
the
definition.
whole point. By definition.
Right.
I was just noticing that Key's book is called The Death of Truth.
Beautiful.
Thomas
I
S.
can't
Kuhn
wait
and
till
the
this comes
Evolution
out.
of Ideas. Yeah, I think it's going to be good.
Yeah. It's sort of like Zen Buddhism. I've often thought that there's one religion that I could that would work for me. It's Zen, because it's so minimalist. And Zen, of course, is a lot is about the limits of language and concepts and so forth. And the whole point is to try to get us to sort of break through the scrim of language and know reality directly, whatever that means. And yet, Zen masters spew out zillions of words telling us to get beyond words. So it's the same sort of contradiction that you see in postmodernism and it's a wonderful paradox. I love it, but it seems to me that at a certain point, all you can do to be true to these views of the world is just to shut up.
Yeah. Isn't that, well, that's the sound of one hand clapping. Maybe.
Right.
Yeah. But, this idea of direct experience, we started out talking about the raisin, and, there we were in Cambridge sitting in the divinity school, and we each were asked to put a raisin in our mouth, and then this guy was sort of speaking hypnotically, and we were trying to experience the raisin without these layers of filters of language and memory and preconception, and just confront it as what it is. And I really felt for a moment that I was getting there, and that I really was, as I described it in my article, the raisin was no longer like this fruit that I knew had been grown on a vine and dried, and it wasn't this one of these things in a box that my mother put in my lunch bag, and it just was.
Yeah.
Raisin. And then I remembered about this time, they were talking about this was mindfulness, and then you very respectfully asked this question. Well, with this concept you have of mindlessness, as though it were a slip of the tongue. I thought that was kind of funny.
Yeah, mindlessness, mindfulness. What is the difference, Glasshopper?
And our brains were resonating according to neuroscience as we were meditating at 40 hertz gamma waves, and it just occurred to me, wasn't that Christoph Koch, who was along with Francis Crick, who had this theory of consciousness, that it was the 40 hertz vibrating brain cells that linked your different parts of your brain together into this kind of holistic, conscious, bound together experience.
That's right. Yeah, maybe we'll find a mystical technology that can emerge from that finding and help us reach the state of serenity and wisdom that we all yearn for so much.
Well, if you turn it up too high, though, it'd be just like dumping a bucket of water inside a computer or a television set, and you're just going to get a big short circuit, and maybe that's when you experience the ultimate nirvana.
Well, there's one other thing that we were going to talk about. I don't know if you want to get to it. Did you want to? Well,
kryptonite.
Yes, kryptonite.
Yes, I mean this story didn't get picked up probably nearly as much as you'd expect, but they discovered kryptonite this week, and I was emailing with a friend of mine, and she sent me this link, and I thought kryptonite, and then I found the story, and well, let me find it here. It was on BBC News. Kryptonite discovered in mine. Kryptonite is no longer just the stuff of fiction feared by caped superheroes. A new mineral matching its unique chemistry, as described in the film Superman Returns, has been identified in a mine in Serbia. Okay, so then they say that, kryptonite in the comic books is green, and of course it, zaps Superman's powers, but the real mineral is actually white and harmless, says Dr. Chris Stanley, a mineralogist at London's Natural History Museum. He says, I'm afraid it's not green, and it doesn't glow either, as kryptonite does. And then he says that, and in fact, the new mineral does not contain fluorine, which it does in Superman, and again, it's white rather than green, but in all other respects, the chemistry matches that for a rock, containing kryptonite, and presumably it doesn't sap the powers of superheroes either. So I guess the reason they're calling it kryptonite is because it's sodium lithium boron silicate hydroxide, and apparently if you do a Google search you can find that that's what kryptonite was fictionally described at, and everyone's marveling at this coincidence. And
That sounds like a slow news day science story.
Yeah, yeah. You wonder. I mean, often we science journalists are criticized for kind of taking the science and hyping it, but I don't think a lot of people realize how often it's presented to the science writers pre-hyped.
Yeah.
And this kryptonite thing seems to me like that's probably an example, unless it was the writer who, said, well, isn't this something like kryptonite? But, it sounds like it came from the scientist. And, the same with these, all the implications of these mirror neurons. And, it comes already kind of packaged to try to get the most media mileage out of it. And
George, you and I and all responsible science journalists are usually taking the hype and exaggeration, inflated claims of the scientists, and trying to bring it back down to reality and show people what the truth is. That's our duty and responsibility, and that's what we try to do to the best of our ability.
It's a thankless task.
Yeah. People would rather have the souped up stuff. I mean, hell, it's just science journalism.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's good. We can, as I was thinking, in terms of graceful endings here. And, earlier we were talking about William James, and we were talking about the brain, and I guess one of the whole themes of our conversation has been, the reductionism of neuroscience, and if what they're really reducing the mind to, just how far the whole purpose of neuroscience is reductionism, right? Because you're taking something like the mind and explaining it as these little biochemical reactions, and then we're just sort of the theme of what we did for the Slate brain package, and also of our conversation is kind of where does this get you, and just knowing that, well, sure enough, the brain is chemical reactions. But I just looked up something that James had said that I ended up writing about when I wrote about Pavlov, and if you'll indulge me for a minute, I'll read it. Okay, it says, and he's saying this with appropriate skepticism, describing a point of view that he doesn't necessarily ascribe to. Okay, so James, he says, if we knew thoroughly the nervous system of Shakespeare and as thoroughly all of his environing conditions, we should be able to show why at a certain period of his life his hand came to trace on certain sheets of paper those crabbed little black marks which we, for shortness' sake, call the manuscript of Hamlet. We should understand the rationale of every erasure and alteration therein, and we should understand all this without in the slightest degree acknowledging the existence of the thoughts in Shakespeare's mind. The words and sentences would be taken not as signs of anything beyond ourselves, but as little outward facts, pure and simple. In like manner, we might exhaustively write the biography of those 200 pounds, more or less, of warmish, albuminoid matter called Martin Luther, without ever implying that it felt.
The English major in me and the humanist in me loves that quote. I'm going to have to repeat this to my friends in the humanities department at my school. That's wonderful, George. Thanks a lot for sharing that with me and with everybody out there in internet land.
This is fun. Well, let's try it again next week.
Sounds good to me.
Maybe we can get to the dying bees that we missed out on this time.
Definitely. All
Sounds
right.
good. Okay,
so long,
John.
George.
Okay, bye.